Beautiful. And hello to the attendees. I can see Alison Lee Sondari. Is that correct, how I said that? And please, you guys who are on Zoom here with us, feel free to introduce yourself. Tell us where you're calling in from while we just wait while Facebook Live prepares. And there we go. We should be streaming live now. Excellent. Hello, hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Superhuman Summit. We have more in store for you in regards to science and spirituality. And you can see before me, so I'm AJ, those who haven't been on some of the calls earlier today, and I have the beautiful Alexis Niki on with us, and she is a narrative coach, and we were just chatting for those who might have heard. Hi, Sondari from Hong Kong, welcome. And Alexis is actually an American but living in Paris. So she's coming in to us today from Europe. We've already had someone in Hong Kong, someone in Arizona, someone in Queensland. So we've had people from all over so far, as well as you all listening, watching, participating at home or at work, wherever you are, all around the world. It is a joy and a delight to bring this Superhuman Summit to you. And as we said right in the beginning, we did our first summit earlier in the year when COVID first hit, as a way of allowing us all to still connect, to interact, to talk about things that were important, and also to give a platform to great ideas that thought leaders around the world have. And Alexis is one of those. So maybe we could start, before you move into your presentation, Alexis, just telling us, how did you get in to become a narrative coach? Or is that going to be part of what you're going to share with us?
That is definitely going to be part of what I'm going to share with you. But I just also want to jump in and say it's so wonderful to be here, especially because of that connectivity that summits like this are making happen during this time. And it's one of the, there are some silver linings of this crisis, and this is one of them, the way people have been connecting around the world and sharing ideas. I think it's just wonderful.
Absolutely. And I think it's been really great as well in comparison to, the live events that we're so used to of the past, where a speaker would come on stage, do their stuff and then leave. But this opportunity through Zoom means that we can actually communicate together and integrate and share. And so you're getting access to speakers like this. Alexis is in Europe, and no matter where you are in the world, you're getting to converse and share and interact. So it has been a silver lining in some ways.
Yeah.
And so let's get underway. And if you're happy to share your screen, you should have control to be able to do that. I will filter, so the people who are in Zoom, you can use the chat box to ask questions or make comments along the way. Those of you in Facebook land, I'm watching and observing you as well. So feel free to pop your thoughts and comments. Thanks, Marlon, coming in from Sydney. We've got Nosh from Melbourne. So everyone, please feel free to interact and be part of the conversation, because that's what we really want to have here, is conversations. So join in, ask questions, and make comments along the way. Over to you, Alexis.
Great, and just to verify, you guys can see my screen okay? All good to go? Okay. So the talk that I am presenting today is called The Hidden Story, the Role of Narrative in Our Understanding of Everything. And as AJ said, I am a narrative coach, but before that, I was a screenwriter. So I've been involved with story for many, many years. And I am a storyteller, obviously. And so I made a shift from the creative field into the business field. And today, what I do with my company called Storynova, based in France, is partner with leaders and teams and organizations to help them enact more intentional stories in the world. And I use the word enact intentionally, as you will see as we go through this presentation, because I really do believe that stories, more than the words that we use, it's how we tell stories with everything that we do, our actions and everything. And I think this will become clearer as I go through the presentation. So the way I've structured this presentation is all you're going to see on the slides, with one exception, are story quotes that mean a lot to me. And this is one of my favorite ones, because it kind of touches on this idea that story is a really huge topic, much bigger than we normally think of. When we think of story normally, we think of it as an object that we craft. It is a book, or it's a film, or a message that we craft to share with other people. So it's a way of communicating. But I'm really going to dive into a different perspective than that, a bigger, broader perspective of it. And today's really about expanding our idea about the power of story, really beyond this idea of communication tool or as a way to convince or influence others. Although, of course, it can also be that. So I'm inviting you to maybe step into this idea that story could be maybe a verb, and an act, something that's really active, or energy, something that can animate and bring things to life, or omnipotence, like omnipresence, sorry, like the air that we breathe, or the water that fish swim in, something that's always there, but remains invisible and remains taken for granted on a deep level. So what I'm trying to do today is awaken your sensitivity to story. This is something you already have because you're human beings, so you have this alertness to story. And what I call that alertness to story is narrative intelligence. So I'm inviting you to tap into your innate narrative intelligence. This means
that. I love the idea of the water the fish swim in, or the air. And I think when we look back to many Indigenous cultures, they knew that power of story and narrative so well, didn't they, for everything that they passed along. And even today in modern life, though, with what people do on social media, they're still telling story in some way, aren't we? We're always constructing. That's what humans do.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think this is what we're going to experience here today, because I'm going to skip a lot of the technical stuff, what is story, how's it structured, the neuroscience and all of that kind of stuff. And we're just going to go into, you'll hear stories, you'll participate a little bit in thinking about stories yourself, and hopefully we'll just have some fun with it. So let's get started.
Let's go.
Let's go. So basically what I'm inviting you on is a narrative adventure, right? The adventures first, leave the explanations aside, and like I said, let's just have some fun. Normally when I present live, the first thing I like to do is get people experiencing story, because like I said, we have narrative intelligence. You are already alert to stories. And what I do is I pair people up and I get people to exchange a story about their name. But I'm going to modify it here. I'm going to ask you to think about a story of your name, whether it's your first name or your last name or your middle name or a nickname. A very short one, a simple one, where does your name come from? What does it mean? Who named you? Do your friends call you something different from your given name? Or if you can't think of anything else, do you like your name or do you not like your name? There's a whole bunch of stories behind that. And capture that in a couple of words or lines and go ahead and put it in the chat. And as you're doing that, I'm going to tell you a short story about my name, and then we'll come back and we'll look at your stories.
Fantastic.
I'll just let AJ jump. Yeah.
Yeah, whether people are in Zoom or in Facebook, please pop a little sentence or so about your name, where it came from, who named you, or anything at all. And that way we can all participate and read and see each other's stories as well. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. So my name is Alexis, and Alexis is a Greek name. I have Greek backgrounds. All four of my grandparents were Greeks, and they immigrated to the US. And I was born in the US, as were my parents. And at the time when I was named, Alexis in the US was a name that was given to women, but that is not the case in Greece. So my mother's mother really had a hard time with it and would always call me Alexia, because it wasn't okay with her that I had a man's name. And then in the 1980s, this show came on the air. I think many of you might remember this, or there's a remake now, the show called Dynasty. And Dynasty was this big soap opera of, very wealthy people living in Denver. And one of the main characters was Alexis Carrington Colby, played by the very glamorous Joan Collins. And if there's anything that my grandmother worshipped, it was Hollywood. So as soon as Joan Collins, strutted on that stage and had the name Alexis, it suddenly became okay with her. Even though Alexis Carrington Colby was a very manipulative, kind of scheming, conniving character, it suddenly became okay with my grandmother, and she started calling me Alexis. So that's a brief story about my name, and I'd love to hear what people are putting into the chat.
Awesome. So I just shared a little bit. Some people would know. So Anuraj is saying change their name 3 times. I know I was named, my Alexandra part was after Princess Alexandra. However, it's actually my middle name. My first name I was christened with was Heidi, after the story about Heidi from the Swiss Alps. But on a holiday or a spiritual pilgrimage in the Himalayas, I had an epiphany to drop my first name. So I kind of outgrew my first name. So that's mine. And then Richard said there's a long story about the derivative of his name, which is not necessarily suitable for social media. I don't know if you mean your first name or your surname, Richard, but rightio. Who else has a name story? Love to know what yours is, Nosh. And I know your handle says Noshi, but your name's Nosh. Marlon, what about for you? Who named you? Who picked your name? Mother, father? Was it an auntie or someone? So
I'm seeing a story in the Zoom chat.
Yeah.
Padma Kumar.
Yeah.
Means son of lotus. It represents the beauty of the lotus flower and its unique capability to bloom both in pristine lakes and in dirty ponds. A lotus also has the ability to allow droplets that come in contact with it to stay as a nice sphere and roll off without getting distracted.
Wow.
So it's really, really lovely.
Wow, that's beautiful. And I love some other cultures and how much they put into a name. So Nosh's is possessor of loyalties. Nice. And I know I just had a friend drop in and pick something up today, and his name means merciful hearted king. So poetic, some of the names from around in other cultures. Yeah.
Yeah. And Aradanjali, her name means prayer to the sun god.
Wow.
Lovely.
Beautiful.
So we see that when we tell a
Sundari
story.
is after the resident deity. Go on.
Nice. It's really lovely. We see that when we share a story, we get so much more than the information, right? At the top of the presentation, everybody had the information about my name. As soon as I told the story, you too, AJ, everybody has the information of your name. But as soon as you tell the story, we immediately go deeper. We learn cultural background. We learn about a process where we get to step into the name that we feel suits us best. We learn, in my case, a little bit about family dynamics, some family conflicts. It really gives us so much more. Storytelling gives us so much more than just information. And storytelling, as personal as something about our names that tap into our identity, goes even deeper than that. And quickly can create connection between people. And that is super powerful.
Yeah.
So I'm going to move into the one slide that isn't a quote, and it's a very brief video, takes about a minute. The sound is unimportant, so if you can't hear the sound, it doesn't matter. This is the video of an experiment that was done in the 1940s by 2 psychologists named Heider and Simmel. And they did this experiment to see what people kind of project onto something that they're seeing. So I'm going to play it. And again, I'm going to ask people to put in the chat, what story are you seeing? Okay, here we go. Okay, so what stories did people see? I can't wait to hear.
Wow. Okay, everyone in the chat box, what stories did you see? It was making me grin. Let's see. Okay, in Facebook land as well, I've just put, what story did you see then in that video? It's amazing how quickly shapes started to take on personas and personalities.
Absolutely, absolutely. Try as you might to keep, an objective sort of, these are just shapes moving around. They certainly take on characteristics.
Here we go.
Right.
Alison here saying a nasty big triangle defending its space against curious invaders and then getting upset because it clearly wasn't secure in that space. Interesting.
Right. Clearly, yes.
What other stories do people see?
Daddy and mom, Mimi Triangle, live in a nice house. They have a lot of fun playing in the lawn outside. Soon they had a kid, Dottie. They take turns in playing with Dottie and with each other when Dottie is fast asleep in the house. It is a happy and playful family. Nice.
Nice. We're seeing the child's choices being rejected by an angry parent. Belinda's saying many emotions, shy and hiding, aggression and intrusive behavior.
Right.
Yeah, we certainly saw something that to me appeared like violence at the end, breaking things apart.
Absolutely. So most of the time people see family situations, they see a love triangle, they see kids, on a playground situation or maybe bullies or something. There's a lot of, as you just touched upon, attribution of character and emotion and motive for these different shapes that we're now seeing as characters, and relationships that we see between these shapes. So the point of all of this is that the story doesn't live in the video, it lives in us. Right? And we're projecting onto this abstract video the stories that we have inside, or stories that we've seen or have absorbed from other places, right? And we look at something that's abstract and we want to attribute meaning to it. We want to close gaps of something that we don't understand. And automatically what we reach for is story, because story is how we create meaning. It's the way we close that circle, right? It's the way we complete things. And it can be from things big and small. From if a friend of ours is late to meet us, how quickly do we go to, oh, maybe this is going on, or maybe that is going on, or maybe that is going on. Maybe this person's always late. We have that story. Or another one, this person is never late. There must be an accident, right? I go there with my husband all the time. As soon as he's like 2 minutes late, it's like, oh my God, he's dead in the road. He's never late, right? We complete those gaps with story. And we look for connections between events. And this is another one of my favorite quotes, because, it's like we've evolved as human beings in so many ways. We have opposable thumbs, we can do so much. But story is what tells us what's important to us, right? It's what helps us create meaning. And this brings us to what's at the base of us as human beings and what's at the base of our stories, which are our human hopes and fears. This is something that I say all the time when I'm teaching about story and I'm coaching people about story, is how core hope and fear is to us as human beings. We are constantly carrying hope and fear. At every moment, we can just look and we'll find it. I mean, right now, or whenever I present, but right now it's, is the slide thing, the screen share going to work okay? Am I going to be talking too fast or too slow? Do I have too much material, not enough material? All of these hopes and fears. with, of course, the hope being I'm going to say something that's interesting to people, that people are going to want to interact with it and all of that. And I'm sure each of you, if you take a moment and you look right now, you can find some hope and fear in your own life. And if you want, feel free to share that in the chat. It can be like banal, almost like what I shared. It doesn't have to be deep and existential, but it's always there. It's always present. And it is also at the core of our stories. Our stories are based on our hopes and fears, right? Every protagonist sets out to achieve something and fears he or she won't.
And so much always about, I think during COVID, it's really raised that even more. So many fears about the safety of interaction, the loss of, my liberties and things like that, that there was COVID, and then there was all the stories that we all made up around it.
Yeah. COVID is a really, really interesting moment from a narrative perspective for me, because what happened is our story that we knew so far, our lives are going along. We were living in a narrative, whatever it was, wherever you were, that we understood. We may not have liked it, hated it, loved it, whatever, but we understood it. Suddenly, overnight, boom. And we don't know what the new narrative will be yet, because it hasn't fully emerged yet. So we're in this in-between space that's a narrative gap. And that's the most uncertain place. That goes right to our survival instincts, to our atavistic fear. And, we've been responding quite well, considering, I think, but really in that space of hope and fear.
Agree. And actually, just so you know, Nosh has said, Alexis, for the record, fear not, you're amazing. It's amazing. Richard's
Thank you.
personality. Yes.
Right.
I don't think
Thank you.
that, Richard. Yeah.
Right. So, so from there, I want to move into a different idea. It's related, of course, it's connected. That story really is a living thing, and living is a story thing, like, we just talked about within the context of COVID. So I really became aware of story when I was a kid living in Greece. So from the ages of, I think I was 2 when we first moved there, and we moved away when I was 7. We lived in Athens. And I remember going out on our balcony, and from our balcony, we could see the Acropolis across the way. And my father, who was a great storyteller, would tell me the myths about the Greek gods, and particularly about Athena, the patron goddess of the city of Athens, whose temple was right across the way, right, that I could see from my balcony. And he would tell me these stories, and I would imagine her flying through the sky and going home at night to the Acropolis. And she felt to me not just the patron saint of the city of Athens, but my personal patron saint. She was right over there, right? And on the other side of the balcony, it was the Mount Lycabettus, which on top of which is a chapel to St. George, slayer of dragons, who my brother had this whole attachment to, right? But to me, I would look over there and say, who cares about St. George? Who cares about the dragons? What's interesting to me is the mountain itself, because Athena dropped it on her way to carrying stones to build the Parthenon. So, we had these very different attachments to different stories in the same city. And at the same time, my father would walk us through downtown and would show us the Agora, where the philosophers used to, hold forth. And I would just imagine the birth of democracy right here in this place that I was living in. And this happened to be during the time of a junta dictatorship in Greece, right? So we had curfews. We were, there was a lot of tension in the air. There were tanks rolling down the streets. It was a scary time in Greece. So what it was layers and layers and layers of stories about this place that I came to think of later as this living storybook, but of all these eras and all these ideas and all these different ways of being together in a city. And it was very perplexing to me, but I think that's where the seed for me was really planted in terms of story, what it means, how it organizes our lives. You know, here was this myth. I knew as a kid she was a myth, but there was this temple and a whole society had believed in this myth at one point, right? And it really fascinated me. And for me, that's, I guess, where I understood that story really is a living thing.
I love that you're demonstrating the power of story in talking about story.
Yeah. So, and with that, I think we do have to acknowledge that the power of story is tremendous. It is tremendously, it can be tremendously constructive, but it can also be tremendously destructive. And it is something we really need to be aware of. I mean, we are aware of it. We know this, right? That story can be deployed as a weapon. It can be used to dehumanize, to inflame resentments. And when stories tap into these deep atavistic fears that we all have and take root there, sometimes it doesn't matter how fantastical the story is, how completely invented it might be, because it touches that kernel of truth inside, which is our existential fear. Because what do our hopes and fears really come down to? It comes down to a matter of life and death. I'm going to wake up tomorrow to live another day. I fear I won't. And if it isn't physical, it is symbolic. You know, I fear I might be banished from the tribe. I fear I won't belong. I fear I won't be loved. I hope I will. So stories can really be quite dangerous.
And I have a perfect example of that. Actually, I'm working with a number of island nations at the moment on sustainability and the environment and waste. And in one of the islands, I won't name, but they've been trying to reduce the amount of smoking people do, and also the rubbish that comes from cigarette butts. And the local priests and elders said that anyone caught within smoking within 3 kilometers of the actual village would be struck down with a voodoo curse. And
Wow.
so they literally walk 3 Ks to have a cigarette. But now they said there's been this great reduction in the amount of people smoking, because they're also concerned that if they've even got the smell on them or something when they return to the village, that they might be cursed. And
Wow.
so, yeah, that's a really powerful way. When I heard that they'd done that, I was like, wow.
Wow. Yeah, that's a powerful story. And, you know, for people's good, but it shows how powerful it is and how much, you know, our beliefs in a particular story system matter to us, right?
And I think
part of our
who the narrator is, because they are senior leaders that are looked up to in their community. You know,
exactly.
Anyone could have said that story and it wouldn't have had as much power as coming from them too.
Exactly. It's a way of organizing and keeping societies safe and functioning sometimes. And, you know, collaboration happens when we share a common story around something, right? But, you know, that is how we build our communities and our societies and our, you know, in any sort of group. And, you know, is it a life-affirming positive story, or is it a destructive story? You know, sometimes it's in the eye of the beholder. I mean, I'm not here to say one way or the other, just to alert to the fact that story is incredibly powerful. And so so I talked about the multi-story, right? About all these stories that we have going on. And it's not just, you know, within the context of, say, a city like Athens, but also internally, we have all our internal stories going on, and often they're conflicting. So we do live in this multi-storied world, but at the same time, I think it's really important to imagine the possibility of no story, of dropping the story, of letting it go, and detaching from it, and to get to something closer to a feeling. And by feeling, I don't necessarily mean emotion. I mean like a real bodily sensation in the here and now, a presence. And this, you know, this is the side of me, the meditator, the part of me who meditates, right? And this has been a real discovery to me through meditation, that there are moments that I can get a glimpse of no story, and those moments are delicious and they're wonderful. And in the rest of my life, I'm just in this multi-story. But what the no story does for me is it's not somewhere I necessarily want to dwell in all the time, but the awareness of the possibility lets me kind of take the multi-stories a little bit less, make them less important as individual stories. I can say, okay, this story is important to me, but I can hold the possibility that somebody has a different story that's equally important to them. So by getting in touch with the idea of no story, it really, for me, opens us up to understanding that that there are so many different types of stories out there, right? And again, I can give a story example. So I'm American living in France, and if anybody knows anything about America and US customer service, it's the whole idea is the customer is king. So when you walk into somebody's store, people will treat you as like royalty, right? They'll come up and they'll ask what you want, can they help you, and that sort of a thing. Well, in France, it's a little bit different. In France, when you walk into somebody's store, you are walking into their domain. They are the proprietor. And they are happy to help you, but within reason. They're not going to bend themselves backwards into pretzels, right, to please the customer. And what this means sometimes is if you walk into a store and they're already busy with somebody else, they're going to keep speaking with that person. They might not even necessarily look up and acknowledge you because it's not your turn yet, right? They'll expect you to wait patiently, and then they will turn to you when it's your turn. You get their full attention. So an American walking into a French small shop like this might start thinking, and this was me in the beginning, right? French people are really rude. It's a really, it's very rude, right? There's no respect here. It took me a while to learn that, I'm looking for respect, but so is the shopkeeper. And we're just defining what respect means in the situation differently in that moment, right? Mm-hmm. For him, respect is, you respect me as much as I respect you. And from my American standpoint in the beginning, I was like, the customer is king, right? So it was something I had to learn, right?
Yes. And are they making a judgment that I'm an American? Have they made, all of those things that we could storytell ourselves? And in fact, they could be being more respectful by staying attentive to the person they're serving. Who knows, right? It's all interpretation.
That's the multi-story, right? We're just swimming in this multi-story. And if you kind of step back and let go of the stories and say, okay, he's busy, I'm waiting, end of story, you have a very different experience, right?
And I love the idea of just dropping the story as well. And I think that takes a bit of consciousness or meditation to do. And I can remember working with an American lady once from South Carolina, and she used to say, stop starring in your own movie, which is kind of a bit like dropping the story. You'd come in and go, this happened and that happened and IT did this and finance. And she'd be like, can you just stop starring in your own movie?
That's a good one. I might have to put it in the quotes in the next iteration. That's really good. Yeah, and the fact is we do all star in our own movies. We are the protagonists of our own life stories, but there's also a way of doing that isn't super dramatic. Let's put it that way. So, and that brings me really, this is my final slide, to the idea that we started in the beginning saying how story is how we understand everything. And I really do think that's true. And I hope I've walked you through why I think that's true. And it is the dominant sound of our lives, from the internal stories that we tell ourselves to the ones that we tell each other as we're building, forming groups, societies, collaborating on teams, in business, outside of business. They are how we make meaning in this world. And that's why I really believe that narrative intelligence, sort of this alertness to this importance of story, is so important to make people aware of and invite people to step into. And we hear often, and I have a problem with it, even though I also think it's true, that all you need to do to change the world is change the story. There is truth in that. But it's also, it's not like, well, I've got a piece of paper, I can erase it and I can just rewrite it, right? It's not an easy thing to do. It's not simple to change one's story. It really takes a lot of inner work. It takes a lot of, I can still feel extremely attached emotionally to some of my stories and also know that they're just mine. And sometimes that can come with a whole host of bad feelings of like, nobody gets me, I'm all alone in this world with my story, but it's still just one perspective. And changing, there are stories that I have tried to change and I've given up. I'm like, nope, it's not going to change. It might change someday, but it's not changing right now. And that's just the way it is, right?
Not today with that story. And I'm just saying, Belinda in the chat box on Facebook is saying this is wonderful and really helpful and enjoyable, which is great as well. And I love that idea that, we carry our stories with us, and it is kind of how we define ourselves. And I know I work a lot in the culture space, and often when we're looking at building a culture or strengthening a culture, it is the stories that weave people together. It is the stories about the CEO rolling up their sleeves and helping when the office got flooded. It's all of those kind of stories. I remember working with some guys in a lab once that were really introverted, and they would just sit at their own little desks in the lab doing their own thing. But at morning tea each day, they would have cake together and they would tell little stories of their families and what was happening. And yet the rest of the day, they never spoke to each other, but they were one of the closest knit teams. And it was through those shared stories. They knew each other's stories and how they fitted in the scheme of things in their families and all of those sorts of things. Yeah. So they can be super binding, I think, as well.
Yeah. Story is really super connecting. And especially because if we understand that when somebody tells a story, we're learning again, multiple layers about who this person is. And the stories don't have to be super well structured. They don't have to be workshopped to death and wordsmithed and everything. They can be very informal, very sort of conversational, and they have this incredible power. And telling somebody your story shows trust, and listening and receiving someone's story is a gift in a sense. It's a gift. You're receiving a gift, but you're also giving a gift to somebody by listening to their story. It's a really intimate exchange, I find, very human exchange. And there's a question in the chat. Can you please share some thoughts about storytelling in the corporate context? When bosses bark, cut out your stories and give me the facts. How do we still leverage the power of stories and making an impact in the corporate context? Okay.
Great question.
It is a great question. And the first question that I would have for the person being told this is to take a moment and look, what kind of a story are you telling? Are you telling the kind of story in which you're communicating powerlessness? You're coming across like, yeah, but this didn't happen because of this or because of that or because of something else, where the boss might start getting kind of like, don't bring me more problems, bring me solutions. Or are you telling a kind of a story that the boss can step into and understand, right? Are you talking from your hopes or are you talking from your fears? Very often in the corporate context, we might talk from our fears. We might come up with an excuse or a reason why something didn't work. And if we can step into a story that talks about the hope and kind of turn the thing around, turn the story that we're telling around in a way that also includes the facts. It's important to include the facts, right? But in a way that the boss can step into it and see himself as a protagonist in the story. And it might be as a mentor person, but from his point of view, that's his role and that's what he's being asked to do. You might have an easier time getting your message across in a more narrative way if you make sure to be speaking from your hope, And when I say speak from your hope, again, it's not from this defensive, like, I hope he doesn't yell at me, but I hope to bring value. And I know, always have to do it for the other person as well, that he hopes to get value from me. He hopes that I will bring him value. He hopes that there will be a solution to this problem. So how can we find that?
Awesome. Yeah, I love that. And there's another question in the Facebook group as well from Richard, which is it possible to craft a story when you are the anti-hero rather than the hero of your own narrative? Ooh.
Well, the anti-hero is already a story, isn't it? So maybe kind of a more rebellious archetype. There are lots of our anti-hero stories out there. And yes, it is possible to craft the story. And I would need to know more about the question that you're asking to be able to answer you more completely. But the anti-hero is an archetype. It is a powerful force in the world. So yeah, it's possible.
And it's coming from Richard, who calls himself a misbehaviorist and an anti-fragilist.
Yeah.
So I think it's a very pointed and very great question from you. And maybe I could say to you, Richard, perhaps you're living it already.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions from anyone in the audience and who's tuned in right now? There's been lots of ground, and yet there's real, I guess, simplicity in the kernel of what you're sharing with us today, Alexis. So yeah, if anyone else has a question or a comment that they wanted to make, and also I'd love to round out with you sharing, you know, how might people look into more of this? Where can they go for more information, either to work with you or find out about more of what you do, but also just, you know, if they're interested in the topic and field?
Yeah, I will definitely touch on that, but there's one last thing that I do want to talk about that I consider quite important is when we talk about meaning, when we talk that stories help us find meaning, define ourselves, understand who we are and all of that. The quote or the definition of meaning that I have found to be the most helpful for me is Joseph Campbell's. Joseph Campbell said that we're not so much seeking meaning as we are an experience of being alive, so that our life experiences on the purely physical plane will have resonances with our own innermost being and reality, so that we actually feel the rapture of being alive. So there is something about the resonance of the inside to the outside, which is that what story helps us understand and create, right?
That's a super powerful quote and concept. Like in itself, it resonates. That's super powerful.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's amazing because when we think about our fiction, right, we like going off into these fantastical worlds in our fiction. It's one kind of storytelling, and then we think about science, which is another kind of narrative, right? And science is about how close can the outer and inner reality come. You know, how close to understanding the outer reality can we get to with science, right? And sometimes fiction is like, how imaginative can we be? How wild and different and, you know, removed from the constraints of real life can some types of fiction get? And it's wonderful because story can be all of these things at the same time. So there's another question. How do we cater to cultural sensitivities when we have a global audience?
Ooh,
yeah. If you're able to interact with that global audience and hear them, hear their stories, include their voices, ask for a difference of perspective, you know, or really also frame whatever stories or whatever you're saying within the context of your own understanding. And even say, you know, in my context, the way I understand this, it's this way. It might be limiting. Some people might have very different perspectives. I invite you to share your perspectives.
And I think also in situations like that, Alexis, it's also kind of chunking up to the larger, bigger picture, isn't it? Sometimes, rather than a more granular story, so that the broader it is, the more you might be able to make it appealing to people of all cultures and backgrounds.
Right. There's that too. And there's also the, if you get really specific in within a particular story with well-chosen details that make something super specific, it actually ends up touching on the universal in a really interesting way.
Right.
So, you can really, put it within its context, but people will find the universality of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so this is where people can get in touch with me. So my website is storynova.com. You can write to me at welcome@storynova.com. I do offer coaching and I offer online workshops. We've got one that's coming up on December 2nd called Leap of Faith, which is all about that gap in the COVID story and how are we getting through it. There is also so much you can read about, learn about. I don't even know where to begin to send people, but you can, if you really want to know more about story, just write to me and I've got some resources that I can send out and share with people.
Brilliant.
Yeah, there's a lot to be learned. Yeah.
That's lovely and really, really generous. And I think story starts at home, even hearing a call earlier today, one of the presenters talking about the stories that he shares with his son. So Enrique Feldman was just talking about the questions he might ask his son at the end of his school day to open him up and to hear more of the story of his day. So I think, there's great value in all of us crafting our day-to-day stories and being open to having an ear to listen to other people's stories.
Absolutely.
And to let that land. Yeah.
And also to look at our hopes and fears on a daily basis is another great place to start. Yeah.
Go above the line, not below. As much as we can, unless you're trying to be the anti-hero. Hey, Richard. People in Facebook land are saying thank you very much. Thank you for sharing your time and your energy and your story with us. A big hello to everyone who's been online. And also, I will remind you that we have another speaker on for the rest of the day today, which is Jeff Marlowe, coming up next straight after this. And also a reminder that we have a great immersion day coming up, and we have a very special offer for that for anyone who's participating in the summit. And I'll pop a link below for that after this lovely, amazing webinar. Thank you for streaming in all the way from beautiful Paris and being part of the story that we're creating over these 3 days about science, spirituality, and becoming more superhuman.
You're welcome. Thank you so much for having me, and have a great rest of the summit.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Good night, everyone, and see you on the next call.